Night settled over the small Midwestern town like a held breath. Streetlights hummed, rain-dark asphalt reflected blue and red flashes, and a quiet grocery parking lot became a stage. The man stood beside his truck, hands open, posture disciplined, eyes forward. He wore a faded jacket, work boots, and the calm of someone trained not to panic. The patrol car door slammed. Another arrived. Radios crackled with coded certainty. An officer's voice cut the air, sharp and rehearsed, demanding identification for suspicion. The word landed without explanation, heavy as a verdict. His name was Marcus Hale. He said it once, evenly, as if names still mattered at night. He reached slowly for his wallet, stopping when ordered. The officer's hand hovered near a holster. Another beam of light searched his face, lingered on his skin, his height, the military haircut grown soft by time. A phone lifted somewhere behind a windshield. Then another. The air tightened. The town watched through glass and glowing screens. Marcus had served 22 years. Infantry first, then logistics, then command support. He had learned how power sounded when it was calm, and how danger hid inside routine words. He knew the difference between lawful order and empty dominance. Tonight, he followed instructions anyway. He had learned that, too. Compliance did not guarantee safety, but resistance guaranteed escalation. The officers circled closer. Questions overlapped, none answered. Where are you coming from? Why are you here? Who does this vehicle belong to? Marcus replied with patience, his voice steady, his answers brief. He offered documents when permitted. The word suspicion returned, repeated like a spell that excused everything. A cuff snapped shut around his wrist. The click echoed. A passerby stopped. A woman whispered that he looked calm. Another officer tightened the cuffs, guiding Marcus toward the cruiser. His phone slipped from his hand and skidded. Someone picked it up and kept recording. The rain began, light at first, dotting his jacket. Marcus did not ask for a lawyer. He asked why. No answer came. Inside the back seat, plastic and vinyl smelled of disinfectant and old nights. The door closed. The town slid past in fragments of light. Marcus stared forward, breathing slow. He thought of schedules, of early mornings, of the weight of responsibility that never left him even now. He thought of rules, and how they were supposed to protect everyone. At the station, the fluorescent lights flattened faces and erased time. Marcus was searched, catalogued, and seated. An officer joked quietly about paperwork. Another glanced at the phone footage already spreading, numbers climbing without sound. Marcus asked for a call. He dialed a number he had not used in years. It rang once. The desk sergeant watched the call connect, unimpressed. On the other end, a voice answered with formality and restraint. Marcus spoke his name again. He gave the location. He said only that he had been detained. He waited. The line stayed open. Minutes passed. The officers returned to routine, confident the night would forget him. One began typing charges that fit the word already chosen. Another leaned back, certain of authority. Marcus sat still. Outside, the rain thickened. Inside, the cameras kept watching. Somewhere beyond the station walls, the call reached a place where rank still mattered. The screen on the sergeant's desk lit up with an incoming call request, routed through channels rarely used after midnight. A pause. A frown. The room quieted. Marcus felt it before he saw it, the subtle shift when certainty loosens. He remained composed, hands folded, eyes forward. The injustice had been ordinary. The night had assumed it would end that way. It was wrong. Footsteps approached the desk. An officer cleared his throat. The phone vibrated again, insistently. Marcus lifted his chin a fraction. He had learned to wait for confirmation, for commands that carried weight. Somewhere, someone was listening closely now. The town's quiet stage held its breath, the camera lights blinked. Outside, a car passed, unaware. Inside, authority prepared to answer authority. Marcus breathed, steady as drill cadence, as the night leaned toward a reckoning it had not planned, and the silence stretched, measured, deliberate, waiting for the first command spoken. The room did not erupt. It narrowed. Conversations softened into murmurs, keyboards slowed, and the casual rhythm of intake processing lost its confidence. The sergeant answered the call without standing, his voice still carrying routine authority. He listened. His expression shifted in increments so small they were almost deniable. He glanced once at Marcus, then away, as if refusing to grant him relevance. The call ended. The sergeant did not explain. He simply told the officer at the desk to hold. Hold was not release. It was delay, a pressure point used to regain control. Marcus remained seated, wrists cuffed, posture unchanged. An officer paced, irritated by interruption. Another pulled up the footage already circulating, eyes narrowing at the angles, the clarity, the sound of commands captured too cleanly. Outside the holding area, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows like an impatient audience. Questions resumed, sharper now, designed to provoke inconsistency. They asked Marcus to repeat his name, his address, his reason for being in the parking lot. He answered the same way each time. The officers compared notes, searching for leverage. None appeared. The word suspicion returned again, now wrapped in procedural language, dressed to survive review. Marcus listened without reaction. He had learned how stories were built after the fact. A supervisor arrived from the back offices, summoned quietly. He surveyed the scene, nodded, and authorized continued detention. The cuffs stayed on. A breath of relief moved through the officers. Control restored, they believed. The supervisor asked Marcus if he understood why he was there. Marcus said he understood he had been detained. The distinction landed poorly. The supervisor's jaw tightened. Outside, the parking lot filled with headlights. A few locals lingered, drawn by lights and rumors. Inside, the station's doors opened and closed as officers came and went, pretending the night was ordinary. It wasn't. The phone on the desk vibrated again, routed higher this time. The supervisor ignored it. The sergeant did not. The call was brief. It ended with a request, phrased as a courtesy, to identify the detainee by service record. The supervisor bristled. He asked who was asking. The sergeant did not answer directly. He said only that it came from command. The word hung there, ambiguous enough to be dismissed, heavy enough to unsettle. They pulled Marcus's information again. The system returned a long trail of service entries, awards abbreviated into codes, deployments listed without detail. An officer scoffed, dismissing it as exaggeration. Another frowned at dates that aligned too neatly. The supervisor waved it off, ordering the process to continue. Paperwork mattered more than profiles. Authority, he believed, was local. Marcus watched their faces, reading the tells. He recognized the pattern: push forward, deny doubt, force the outcome. He said nothing. He had learned that escalation did not always sound loud. Sometimes it sounded like stubborn routine. The supervisor decided to move Marcus to a holding cell. The officers stood him up, guiding him down the corridor. Cameras followed. Marcus walked without resistance, shoulders squared, steps measured. In the cell, the door closed with a final clank. The supervisor told him to think about cooperation. Marcus nodded once. Minutes stretched. The footage online climbed. Comments multiplied. Someone recognized Marcus from an old base photo, posted years ago, half forgotten. Others argued. The station remained insulated, confident the storm would pass before morning. Then the phone rang again, louder now, its ring cutting through the hum. This time the supervisor answered. His voice changed almost immediately. He straightened, then stilled. He listened longer than before. When he spoke, his words were careful, deferential. He said yes. He said of course. He ended the call without meeting anyone's eyes that he ordered Marcus returned to intake. The officers complied, irritation masked as efficiency. Marcus emerged from the cell, cuffs still on. The supervisor asked him to confirm his last duty station. Marcus did. The supervisor asked for his commanding officer's name. Marcus gave it, evenly, without emphasis. The room absorbed it. A lieutenant entered, summoned late, uniform crisp despite the hour. He greeted the supervisor quietly, then looked at Marcus with a longer gaze. He asked no questions. He checked the phone, stepped aside, and made a call of his own. When he returned, the atmosphere had shifted again, tightening with anticipation rather than control. The lieutenant instructed the officers to pause all processing. He asked Marcus if he needed water. It was the first courtesy of the night. Marcus accepted. The lieutenant handed it himself, careful, almost respectful. The cuffs remained, but the tone had changed. Another call came in, routed directly to the lieutenant. He answered and moved away, voice lowered. The supervisor watched, unsettled now, the certainty draining from his posture. When the lieutenant returned, he asked the supervisor to clear the room. Officers hesitated, then obeyed. Alone with Marcus, the lieutenant spoke carefully. He acknowledged Marcus's service. He said there had been a misunderstanding. Marcus listened, expression unchanged. The lieutenant said they were waiting on confirmation. Marcus nodded. He had expected this moment, the slow turn when escalation reveals its direction. The doors opened again. A captain arrived, then another. The station felt suddenly small. The captain glanced at Marcus, then at the supervisor. He asked who authorized the arrest. The supervisor answered. The captain did not respond immediately. He checked his phone, then looked up with a question he did not need answered. Outside, engines approached, not sirens, but presence. Inside, rank gathered. The cuffs on Marcus's wrists felt heavier, not because they tightened, but because their justification thinned. The escalation had reached its limit. The system had pushed as far as it could without acknowledging the force now pushing back. Marcus stood calmly, centered, as the station prepared to receive authority it could not redirect. The night's momentum slowed, deliberate now, every movement measured. Somewhere beyond the doors, a vehicle stopped. Footsteps sounded, purposeful, unhurried. The room waited. Authority did not retreat. It doubled down, quieter now, more procedural, cloaked in policy language that made every action sound inevitable. The supervisor reclaimed the center of the room, posture stiff, voice formal. He informed Marcus that detention would continue pending verification. The cuffs stayed. The door stayed closed. Control, he believed, could still be asserted if framed as patience. Paperwork spread across the counter. Forms were printed, stamped, signed. The arrest narrative began to solidify, words chosen carefully to justify what had already happened. Observed loitering. Evasive answers. Officer safety concerns. Each phrase was clean, familiar, designed to survive scrutiny by sounding ordinary. Marcus listened as fragments were read aloud, recognizing the architecture of a story built to outlast truth. An officer returned with a camera, documenting Marcus again, angles adjusted to avoid eye contact. Another requested fingerprints for confirmation purposes. The supervisor approved it, citing protocol. Marcus complied. Ink pressed into skin. The machine hummed. Identity reduced to lines and whirls, stripped of context. Authority preferred symbols to substance. The lieutenant hovered nearby, uneasy but silent. He watched the supervisor move forward, watched the process harden. He knew when to speak and when silence preserved position. Tonight, silence was safer. The captain stood back, arms crossed, letting the supervisor own the outcome. Rank, after all, distributed responsibility downward. The phone on the desk buzzed again. The supervisor ignored it. He instructed the officers to finish intake. He ordered Marcus's personal effects bagged. Wallet. Keys. Phone. Each item catalogued as property, as if ownership itself were temporary. The officer handling the phone hesitated, noticing missed calls stacking from unknown numbers routed through secure channels. He said nothing. Outside the holding area, an officer laughed quietly, releasing tension with familiarity. Another complained about overtime. The night resumed its routine rhythms, pretending the escalation had peaked. Authority, convinced of itself, often mistook persistence for legitimacy. Marcus sat on the bench again, wrists bound, shoulders relaxed. He watched the supervisor speak, watched the careful avoidance of his eyes. He had seen this posture before, in briefing rooms and forward bases, when officers clung to procedure because judgment had failed. He felt no anger. He felt recognition. The supervisor approached him directly, voice measured. He explained that cooperation would expedite resolution. Marcus replied that he had been cooperative. The supervisor reframed, suggesting answers could be clarified. Marcus declined to elaborate beyond what he had already provided. The supervisor's patience thinned. He warned Marcus about obstruction. Marcus said nothing. A junior officer shifted uncomfortably. He glanced at the lieutenant, then at the captain, then back to the supervisor. He had seen the service record on the screen, the length of it, the consistency. He had heard the tone of the calls, the way voices changed when rank entered the line. He said nothing. Authority did not reward doubt. The supervisor ordered Marcus placed back in the cell. The cuffs were tightened slightly, not enough to bruise, enough to remind. Marcus stood and walked without resistance. The door closed again, heavier this time. Inside the cell, the bench was cold. The light hummed. The camera blinked red. Minutes passed. Then more. The supervisor returned to his desk, satisfied that containment equaled resolution. He authorized a preliminary charge to justify the hold. The language was vague, expandable, a placeholder that could be amended later. He believed time was his ally. The lieutenant's phone vibrated. He glanced at it, then away, jaw set. He stepped into the hallway to answer. His voice dropped. When he returned, his expression had changed, not with fear, but with calculation. He asked the supervisor if the detainee had been informed of the reason for arrest. The supervisor said yes. The lieutenant asked what that reason was. The supervisor repeated the word suspicion, now surrounded by qualifiers. The lieutenant nodded, unsatisfied. Another call came in, this one routed through channels that bypassed the front desk entirely. The captain answered. His posture shifted as he listened. He turned slightly away from the room, as if privacy could delay consequence. He spoke briefly, respectfully, then ended the call. He looked at the supervisor, then at the lieutenant. He said nothing. The supervisor sensed it now, the thinning air, the subtle withdrawal of support. He asserted himself louder, ordering officers to remain focused, to avoid distraction. He cited chain of command. He reminded them that no outside pressure dictated local enforcement. His voice carried conviction born of habit, not certainty. Inside the cell, Marcus remained still. He could hear fragments through the door, the cadence of voices, the pauses that betrayed uncertainty. He knew escalation had reached the phase where authority tested whether it could outlast accountability. He had seen it fail before. The officer monitoring the cameras adjusted his chair, watching Marcus sit calmly under fluorescent light. He checked the timestamp, then the call log. The numbers unsettled him. He forwarded one missed call to the lieutenant without comment. The lieutenant glanced at it, then at Marcus through the glass. The supervisor ordered coffee. He settled in, preparing for a long night. Authority often assumed endurance equaled victory. He did not notice the way the room had changed, the way conversations quieted when he spoke, the way eyes avoided him now. He did not notice that escalation had drawn attention upward, beyond his reach. Another vehicle arrived outside, unmarked, engine idling. The captain noticed. He stepped to the window, peered out, then checked his phone again. The lieutenant joined him. Neither spoke. The supervisor continued dictating notes, building a record that would soon be read by people who did not know him, who did not share his assumptions. He wrote faster, trying to stay ahead of something he could not name. Inside the cell, Marcus closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. He breathed, steady, grounded. He had done his part. The rest belonged to the system now, to see whether it would protect itself or correct itself. The misuse of authority had become complete, not in violence or shouting, but in refusal to listen, in insistence that power justified itself. The station held that posture for a few more minutes, suspended between confidence and consequence, as footsteps approached from beyond the doors, carrying weight that procedure could not absorb. The doors opened without urgency. No sirens. No raised voices. Just presence. The unmarked vehicle outside had stopped long enough for its engine to cool, long enough for intention to settle. Footsteps crossed the threshold with the assurance of someone who did not need permission to enter. Conversations inside the station stalled mid-sentence. A man in a dark overcoat stepped into view, posture upright, movements economical. His hair was silver at the temples, his face composed in the way that came from decades of command rather than age. He carried no badge on his chest, no visible weapon, only a phone held loosely at his side. The captain recognized him first. His shoulders squared instinctively. The lieutenant straightened. The supervisor did not move at first, still writing, still believing control resided at his desk. The man looked around once, assessing the room the way a strategist read terrain. His eyes passed over officers, over paperwork, over the holding area. When they reached Marcus, seated behind glass, they paused. The man approached the desk. He spoke quietly, addressing the captain by name. The title followed, precise, correct. The captain responded immediately, formal, deferential. The man asked a single question, phrased plainly, without accusation. Why was a decorated veteran in cuffs for suspicion? The supervisor looked up, startled by the tone rather than the content. He began to explain, defaulting to procedure, to officer safety, to discretion. The man listened without interruption, his expression unchanged. When the supervisor finished, the man nodded once, as if acknowledging a completed report. He then asked for Marcus by name, pronouncing it correctly. He asked to see him. The captain hesitated only a moment before ordering the cell opened. The supervisor objected, citing protocol. The captain cut him off with a glance. The door buzzed. Marcus stood as the door opened, hands still cuffed. The man stepped closer, stopping at arm's length. He looked at Marcus, not at the restraints. He addressed him formally, using his rank, a rank Marcus had not heard spoken aloud in years. The room went silent. Marcus acknowledged him with a nod, posture instinctively straightening. The man asked if Marcus was being treated well. Marcus answered honestly, briefly. The man turned back to the room. He introduced himself by title alone. The effect was immediate. The lieutenant swallowed. The captain exhaled slowly. The supervisor stiffened, recognition dawning too late. The man was a general. Active duty. 4 stars. His authority did not need amplification. It occupied the room like gravity. He asked who authorized the arrest. The supervisor spoke, voice tight. The general asked on what grounds. The supervisor repeated the word that had carried him through the night. Suspicion. The general let the word sit there, unchallenged, until its emptiness was undeniable. He asked if there was probable cause. The supervisor hesitated. He asked if there was a warrant. The supervisor said no. He asked if Marcus posed an immediate threat. No answer came. The general nodded again, as if closing a file. He then asked for the cuffs to be removed. The supervisor protested. The general did not raise his voice. He simply repeated the request, slower this time. The captain nodded to an officer. The cuffs were unlocked. The sound was sharp, final. Marcus flexed his wrists once, then let his hands rest at his sides. The general thanked the officer who removed them. He turned to Marcus and apologized, formally, for the inconvenience and the failure of the system. Marcus accepted with the same calm he had carried all night. The general addressed the room, his tone instructional rather than punitive. He reminded them of the oath they shared, civilian and military alike. He spoke of authority as a responsibility, not a shield. He did not mention race. He did not mention cameras. He did not need to. He asked for all documentation generated that night. The captain ordered it gathered. The supervisor stood frozen, watching his narrative collapse under its own weight. The general asked for names. They were given. He asked for timelines. They were provided. Phones were checked. Calls were made. The general stepped aside to speak quietly into his phone, issuing instructions that traveled faster than rumor. When he returned, his expression had not changed, but the room had. He informed the captain that an external review would begin immediately. He informed the supervisor that he was relieved pending investigation. The words were precise, administrative, devastating. The supervisor tried to speak. The general held up a hand, not unkindly, but firmly. Not now. Marcus watched without satisfaction, without anger. This was not revenge. It was correction. Authority had revealed itself, not through force, but through clarity. The general turned to Marcus once more. He asked if Marcus needed anything before leaving. Marcus said no. The general nodded. He walked Marcus to the door himself. As they exited into the rain-soaked night, cameras caught the moment from a distance. The image spread quickly, a man who had been detained walking free beside a general, posture equal, dignity intact. Inside the station, silence settled where certainty had been. The power reversal was complete, not with spectacle, but with recognition. Authority had spoken to authority, and the night's assumptions had dissolved under the weight of truth. The consequences did not arrive with headlines or handcuffs. They arrived the way real accountability often does, methodical, procedural, unavoidable. By morning, the station was no longer insulated by routine. Internal affairs vehicles pulled in before the first shift change. Doors opened and closed with unfamiliar faces moving through familiar halls, clipboards in hand, expressions neutral. The supervisor was asked to surrender his badge and weapon. The request was calm, documented, witnessed. He complied stiffly, jaw clenched, still trying to reconcile authority with its sudden absence. An officer escorted him to an interview room, not as a suspect, not yet, but no longer as command. The room he had controlled all night now belonged to review. Body camera footage was secured. Every angle. Every timestamp. The casual language, the repetitions of suspicion, the tightened cuffs, the ignored calls, all of it catalogued. Dispatch logs were pulled. Call routing was traced. The moments when phones rang unanswered became focal points, markers of choice rather than oversight. The officers involved were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Some protested quietly. Others said nothing, already replaying the night in their heads, recognizing the points where different decisions had been possible. The junior officer who had forwarded the missed call was asked to provide a statement. He did, carefully, truthfully. It mattered. The captain submitted a preliminary report before noon, tone restrained, language precise. He acknowledged procedural failures without assigning motive. He understood how these things unfolded, how records shaped outcomes. He chose accuracy over loyalty. By afternoon, the footage circulating online had reached national attention. Commentary stayed restrained at first, then sharpened as details emerged. The image of Marcus walking beside the general replayed across screens, not as spectacle, but as contrast. The calm dignity against institutional resistance resonated. The story held because it did not need embellishment. Marcus did not speak publicly. He returned home, removed his jacket, and sat quietly for a long time. He answered calls from former colleagues, from neighbors, from people he had not spoken to in years. He thanked them and declined interviews. He had said everything that mattered already. The department issued a statement acknowledging an incident under review. It avoided conclusions. It promised transparency. The language was familiar, cautious. But this time, oversight was real, external, immune to quiet resolution. The general's involvement ensured that, within days, the supervisor was formally charged with policy violations, unlawful detention, failure to establish probable cause, dereliction of duty. The charges were administrative at first, then expanded as review uncovered patterns. Prior complaints resurfaced, previously dismissed, now re-examined with context. A record took shape: the officers who tightened the cuffs, who escorted Marcus to the cell, who laughed outside the holding area, were interviewed separately. Their accounts varied. Discrepancies were noted. The word suspicion appeared too often, unsupported. Training records were pulled. Body cam activation times were scrutinized. Authority was being measured against its own standards. The department's leadership convened an emergency meeting. Legal counsel advised cooperation. Public relations advised restraint. The chief listened, then ordered a full audit of stop and detain practices. The decision was not altruistic. It was survival. The department understood that credibility, once fractured, required visible repair. The supervisor resigned before formal termination. His letter cited stress and misunderstanding. It was accepted without ceremony. The resignation did not halt the investigation. It shifted it. Findings were still issued. Sanctions followed. Pension considerations were reviewed. Authority did not disappear quietly. The captain received a formal reprimand for failure to intervene sooner. The lieutenant received mandatory retraining and a notation in his file. Consequences distributed themselves unevenly, reflecting proximity to decision-making. The system corrected, imperfectly, but visibly. Marcus was invited to a closed-door meeting with the Chief and Civilian Oversight Board. He attended, not to accuse, but to answer questions. He described the night without embellishment. He spoke of compliance, of silence, of patience. He spoke of how easily routine becomes cover. The room listened. The board released its findings publicly. The language was clear. The detention was unjustified. The escalation was unnecessary. The failure to respond to calls constituted negligence. Recommendations followed: revised training, revised supervision protocols, mandatory de-escalation audits. Names were included. Accountability was not abstract. The footage continued to circulate, now accompanied by context rather than outrage. Viewers saw the full arc: the detention, the delay, the arrival, the release, the aftermath. The satisfaction came not from humiliation, but from consequence. From seeing authority corrected using its own mechanisms, Marcus received a formal apology letter from the department. He read it once, then placed it in a drawer. He did not frame it. He did not post it. He did not need validation. The outcome spoke for itself. The station returned to routine, but not the same routine. Officers hesitated longer before detaining. Supervisors asked more questions. Phones were answered faster. The night Marcus was detained became a reference point, a quiet reminder that escalation had a cost. Consequences settled into the institution like a recalibration. Not dramatic. Not complete. But real. Authority had been exposed, corrected, and forced to account for itself. The system had not been dismantled. It had been adjusted. Under pressure, toward fairness. Marcus moved forward without fanfare. He resumed his life, his work, his mornings. The night remained with him, not as trauma, but as proof. Proof that calm endurance could outlast misuse. Proof that authority, when challenged correctly, could still be made to answer. Reform did not announce itself. It unfolded through memos, schedules, revised checklists, and uncomfortable meetings where silence no longer worked. The department's audit expanded beyond the single night, tracing patterns across months. Stops made without clear cause. Detentions justified by language that meant nothing when examined. Supervisory approvals granted out of habit. Each finding nudged the institution toward a reckoning it could no longer postpone. Training protocols were rewritten. Not cosmetically, but structurally. The word suspicion was flagged, constrained, redefined. Officers were required to articulate specific, observable factors before detaining anyone, and those articulations were logged in real time, not after the fact. Supervisors were made accountable for reviewing those entries before approving continued holds. Paperwork became a gate, not a shield. Body camera policy changed. Automatic activation thresholds were lowered. Failure to activate became presumptive misconduct rather than a technical lapse. Review teams were expanded to include civilian oversight, not as observers, but as participants with veto authority. The cameras stopped being passive recorders and became active constraints on behavior. Dispatch protocols were revised to prioritize routed calls from verified command channels. Missed calls now triggered escalation rather than delay. The night Marcus was detained became a case study, anonymized in training slides but unmistakable in detail. Officers watched the footage not to shame, but to understand how ordinary decisions compounded into institutional failure. Supervisors attended mandatory leadership reviews focused on intervention. The question was reframed, not whether an officer technically complied with policy, but whether a supervisor actively prevented escalation when doubt appeared. Silence was no longer neutral. It was measurable. The department partnered with an external civil rights firm to conduct quarterly reviews. Their findings were published. The transparency unsettled some, reassured others. Complaints increased at first, not because misconduct spiked, but because reporting felt possible. Over time, the nature of complaints shifted, from accusations of abuse to concerns about clarity and procedure. It was progress, uneven but tangible. The city council allocated funds for independent oversight staffing. The vote was close. The debate was tense. The footage from the station was played without commentary. It did what arguments could not. The measure passed. Marcus was asked to consult on the training revisions, not as a symbol, but as a voice with experience on both sides of authority. He agreed under conditions: no speeches, no publicity, no attribution. He reviewed materials, suggested language, flagged assumptions. He emphasized calm compliance, clear articulation, and the danger of vague power. His influence was quiet, embedded. Recruit classes received updated instruction on authority reversal, not as humiliation, but as inevitability. They were taught that every action could be reviewed by someone with more power, more context, more distance. That professionalism meant acting as if that review was already happening. The lesson resonated. Metrics began to change. Unjustified detentions declined. Supervisor interventions increased. Officers reported feeling constrained at first, then steadier. Clarity replaced improvisation. The department's internal surveys reflected reduced complaints and improved morale among officers who preferred predictability over dominance. The reforms reached beyond the department. Neighboring jurisdictions requested copies of the audit. State-level committees cited the case in hearings about detention standards. The General's Office issued guidance to military installations on civilian interactions, reinforcing cooperation channels. Authority aligned. Incrementally, the viral footage faded from feeds, replaced by newer outrages elsewhere. What remained were policies, habits, expectations. The night became institutional memory, not folklore. It was referenced in meetings without drama. As a point of calibration, Marcus attended one final oversight session months later. He listened more than he spoke. When asked if the reforms were sufficient, he answered carefully. He said systems improve when they expect to be questioned. He said vigilance mattered more than perfection. The room took notes. Reform did not fix everything. It rarely does. But it narrowed the gap between power and accountability. It reduced the space where vague authority could operate unchecked. It made future misuse more difficult, more visible, more costly. The station settled into a new normal. Phones were answered. Questions were asked sooner. Officers hesitated before defaulting to detention. Supervisors intervened earlier. The changes were small in isolation, cumulative in effect. The system had absorbed the lesson without spectacle. That was the point. Justice did not require noise to be effective. It required structure, memory, and the willingness to adjust when exposed. The night did not linger in Marcus's life as a wound. It settled instead as a marker, a line between how things had been and how they were now required to be. Weeks later, he returned to the grocery store parking lot at dusk, not to reclaim anything, but to confirm something quieter. The lights hummed the same way. Cars came and went. No one noticed him standing there for a moment longer than necessary. He breathed in, steady, and left. Justice rarely announces completion. It closes doors softly and leaves systems changed enough that repetition becomes harder. Marcus understood that. He did not measure the outcome by apologies or headlines, but by absence, by nights that did not end in cuffs, by calls that were answered, by supervisors who paused before proceeding. The general checked in once more before returning to his post. The conversation was brief, respectful, finished without ceremony. Rank receded. Responsibility remained. That was how it was supposed to work. Marcus resumed his routines. Morning coffee. Work. Evening spent quietly. People still recognized him occasionally, nodded with a familiarity shaped by a story they had watched unfold. He returned the nods and kept moving. Dignity, once restored, did not need to be displayed. At the station, a new intake officer stopped a man one night for loitering. He asked questions. He listened to the answers. He documented specifics. A supervisor reviewed the entry and released the man without delay. No one recorded it. No one shared it. It mattered anyway. The system would fail again, somewhere. Marcus knew that too. Power always tested its limits. But now, the limits were clearer. The cost of crossing them was visible. Authority had been reminded that it answered upward as well as outward. The footage from that night remained archived, cited occasionally in training, referenced without drama. It no longer belonged to outrage. It belonged to instruction. That was the most durable form of justice. Marcus did not seek gratitude. He did not seek recognition. What he carried forward was simpler, proof that calm endurance could force systems to reveal themselves, and that when exposed, those systems could still choose correction over collapse. The night had assumed silence would protect it. It was wrong. If this story held you, it was not because of confrontation, but because of consequence. Because power was met with patience, arrogance with structure, and misuse with accountability. That is how reform begins, not with noise, but with clarity. If you value stories where dignity outlasts dominance, where justice is deliberate and consequences are real, stay with this series. These are not stories about perfect systems. They are stories about systems being forced, moment by moment, to become better.